Nation building is a multi-dimensional concept, and it involves the active participation of its citizens in various walks of life. A strong and powerful nation is built on dedication and hard work of its citizen and some amount of smart planning on the part of the government. There are various facets of nation building, among which human resource, reducing the social and economic disparity that exists in the society, creating an enabling environment, and adherence to constitutionalism and the rule of law. The history of Kenya's constitution making and review process can be traced back to the colonial period. Different periodic clusters outline themselves clearly. Based on the prevailing political dispensation, a critical look at this history reveals a distinct pattern. One where the political class has consistently sought to initiate, drive, and determine the outcome of any constitutional review, with a view to consolidating elite political power, stemming any dissent and competition, shifting the goalposts on their obligation as duty bearers, and clawing back on the rights of people. Kenyan women have been part of the national struggle from the beginning of time. Amongst the well-known names are Mekatilili wa Menza, Chief Wangu wa Makeri. All these women and many others that followed in their footsteps, like Grace Onyango, the first woman to be elected in parliament, Josephine Sinyo, the first woman with disability to be nominated to parliament, and Priscilla Abwao, the only woman to have attended the Lancaster talks that gave Kenya the independence constitution.
The independence constitution was drafted at Lancaster House. It was part of what are known as the Lancaster House constitutions. Its primary purpose was to negotiate independence. There was a woman that was there. They just didn't allow her to speak. She was called Priscilla Abwao. She presented a memorandum on the rights of the African woman. That memorandum made several demands around women's socio-economic rights. But Priscilla was a lone voice. She was not allowed to speak. And so the demands around women's rights were not captured in the new constitution.
This was so much so that the colonial constitutions were referenced to the colonial secretary that developed them. Women were largely absent from the mainstream conversations. The only exception is Priscilla Abwao, who was at the Lancaster Conference of 1962.
The Lancaster House conferences were three. Priscilla presented the memorandum and was a delegate to the second one, where most of the independence constitution was drafted. Most of what, of what constituted, what ended up becoming the independence constitution was drafted.
As well as Honorable Chelagat Mutai, who was amongst the only two people who voted against a constitutional amendment in Parliament in 1976. Shortly after the outbreak of the Mau Mau Rebellion, the colonial secretary Oliver Lyttelton decided in 1954 to introduce a new constitution for Kenya.
One of the things that many people, and unfortunately many Kenyan women, don't realize is that Kenyan women were not citizens under the old constitution. The most basic fundamental right, because if you're not a citizen of a country, you don't have the right to negotiate on behalf of that country. You don't, the basis of our claims is citizenship.
One of the issues of concern for women was the fact that they could not grant citizenship to either their foreign husbands or their children. And that was contained at Article 90 and 91 of the Independence Constitution, of the older Constitution. So women could not, if they married foreign men, they could not confer citizenship on them, and their children could not be citizens of Kenya. And so that was one of the issues that made women struggle to have that right. And We are happy we got the right in the constitution, and women now enjoy that right to confer citizenship on their foreign husbands and on their children. Although implementation, as we all know, of some of these things has become problematic, but the right is now contained in the 2010 constitution.
Under the old constitution, one was a citizen either by being the child, the son of a Kenyan man. The constitution was particular. It said the father. Yeah, any person is a citizen. It starts by saying any person whose parents are citizens, and then it says the son. when it and then it explains this, the father, any person whose father is Kenyan. So basically, you know, you had to be the child of a Kenyan son in order to be Kenyan. The other way the other opportunity that entitled you to apply to be a Kenyan citizen, unless you were applying to be a naturalized citizen, was any woman who is married to a Kenyan citizen. So it was not any man who is married. It wasn't any person. It was specific, any woman who is married to a Kenyan. And you know, women were not marrying other women. So, you know, so you either had to be the son. The persons that had the power to bestow citizenship were men. And they had that power by virtue of being the sons of Kenyan men.
Following independence, the political maneuvering between KANU and KADU continued. In 1964, Kenya assumed the status of a republic. This provided the first opportunity to amend the constitution. The amendment created the position of President of the Republic, who was also the head of state and commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Grace Onyango was the first woman to be elected mayor in 1967 and the first woman into parliament in 1969. She was also the first woman elected Secretary General of the Luo Union Movement. During her first term, she served on the committee that was tasked with investigating the death of J.M. Kariuki. When the report was tabled by the chairperson Elijah Mwangale, she protested that the report had been altered. She and her colleague Martin Shikuku had secretly hidden the original report. She also lobbied for the abolition of bicycle taxes. Chelagat Mutai contested for the Eldoret North constituency seat at the age of 24 in 1974. She won, beating 12 other contestants to become the first Nandi and Kalenjin woman MP. She was the first female student to become the editor of the University of Nairobi magazine, the University Platform magazine. She used the university's magazine as a platform to criticize the Kenyatta government. She was credited with fighting for the rights of squatters, a matter which even landed her in jail. Wangare Maathai was another woman of great political significance. She started the Greenbelt movement in 1977 to support environmental conservation through tree planting. She became the chairperson of the National Council of Women of Kenya. In 1988, the Greenbelt movement carried out pro-democracy activities such as registering voters for the election and pressing for constitutional reform and freedom of expression amidst various attempts to clamp it down by the government of the day. The decade following the attempted coup d'etat of 1982 has been described by many scholars as one of the most repressive periods in the history of post-independence Kenya. The stage had been set for constitutional amendments by the first president. The second president was facing great opposition that had threatened his very survival. He was not going to leave anything to chance. The result was an undemocratic and authoritarian system of the government. One of the significant amendments was the inclusion of Section 2A into the Constitution, which abolished the multi-party system and made Kenya a single-party state in 1982.
You know, Kenya first became a one-party. Kenya became a de facto one-party state, actually, in 1965. when KADU, at independence, under the independence constitution, we were a multi-party state. We also had a parliamentary system of government. Around 1964, 1965, KANU and the Kenya African National Union, our two largest independence parties, KANU and KADU, the Kenya African Democratic Union, merged. So we became a de facto one-party state in 1965. That means in practice we were a one-party state, even though the law still provided for us to be a multi-party state. Then in 1966, the KPU, the Kenya People's Union, was set up by Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, Bildad Kagia, and several other political actors who were considered to be dissidents. Yeah. The regime of the day was actually not happy about this. Those activities occasioned what was known as the little election. And so there was an election that had to be held because of these activities that had happened between the merging of KANU and KADU and the registration of KPU. And by 1969, the attempts to ensure that multipartism was closed down and that these dissidents were basically contained and suppressed occurred and began to take a legal form. So most of the amendments to the Independence Constitution that were very damaging in terms of political rights, civil and political rights, actually happened by 1969. So in 1969, the KPU was proscribed. The law prohibit, it was banned. Not only was it banned, the members of the party, Oginga Odinga himself, was put under house arrest, and detention without trial is reinstated. This is something that had been done by the British, and now it gets reinstated. And so Wesonga Sijeyo and Abdulatif Abdallah, the poet, who were considered to be dissidents and were members of KPU, were affiliated with KPU, were put in jail, and they were detained without a trial. So they became our first prisoners of conscience in independent Kenya. Wesonga Sijeyo was not released until Moi came into power in 1978. He was one of the people that was freed by Moi, and so he served as a prisoner of conscience for over a decade. And so in a way, the clamor for constitutional reform actually was born way back in the 1960s, because people realized quite early that that the little bit of freedom that we had enjoyed in the immediate post-independence era was very quickly being destroyed. By 1969, we had already had our first assassination. Pio Gama Pinto was assassinated in 1965. So you can see the mood of the country changing very fast from the euphoria of independence in 1963. By within 6 years of independence already, we are having this clamor. And so in 1982, after the coup, the constitution itself was actually amended, and we moved from being a de facto one-party state to a de jure, which means by law we had become a one-party state. And so that is the genesis of the famous or infamous Section 2A, which had to be repealed in late 1991 in order for the multi-party elections to happen in 1992. Now, even after we had our first multi-party elections since the 1960s, since 1966 basically, in 1992. Now, even though we now had, even though now legally we could have different political parties, everything else that had kept the one-party state in place, all the other amendments that had been put in place that had created such a repressive political culture were not removed. The only thing that had happened was the repeal of Section 2A. And so the Kenyan people, and in particular the opposition, the political opposition, realized very fast that repealing Section 2A wasn't enough. And so you had, I think in 1992, in 1993, 1992, the rebirth, because don't forget those elections also, there was a lot of violence. People were displaced. At that time, we used to have a friend who very sardonically and sarcastically says that until 2007, we used to do pre-election violence, and then in 2007, we started doing post-election violence. Either way, we were engaged in violence. And so, yeah, it's very sad, but yeah. And so people had been displaced, and so we had mass violations of rights. And so then we had this beginning in earnest of a popular movement for constitutional reform.
Taking advantage of the return of political pluralism in 1991, the NSWK in 1992 organized a big national women's convention in collaboration with FIMNET, bringing together about 2,000 women from around the country. This convention marked a significant moment in the women's journey of political participation. It served as a point for galvanizing support, building women's agency, developing strategies, and becoming a program of work for collectively attacking the problem.
In, I think it was February 1992, the first major women's meeting, which was actually a conference, an international conference, was organized by FEMNET, the award, which is African Women in Research and Development, which I was co-chair with Professor Sanyisha Hasiani, and also National Council of Women of Kenya, among other organizations. They brought the women together. And during that particular meeting, Professor Maria Nzomo presented the paper on affirmative action, the 30% that we have been talking about, which became a rallying call for women. We are looking for 30%. During that meeting, we had women leaders such as Honorable Phoebe Osio, who has always been on the journey. Wangari Maathai was there, Charity Gilu was there, Martha Karua was also there, and many other women. And it was like, for them, this was the launch of the women's movement to move towards participating in the struggles for democracy, as well as the constitutional amendments that were being proposed even at that time in order to change our own one-party system. So that convention, it was actually called Women's Convention, was a very, very important meeting. The women were together. There were many. We were packed in the Kenyatta International Conference Center. That's where it took place. And the women never went back after that.
So after that conference, the women just kept on organizing and trying to find ways and means of bringing their issues onto the negotiating table.
This period also witnessed a strengthening of the voice calling for constitutional reform. Political players had teamed up with non-state actors and development partners in pushing for this agenda. Beyond just constitutional reform, the central agenda in this period was to eventually effect regime change. As such, with an increasingly strengthened opposition voice in parliament, The amendments in this period were geared towards building the platform that would bring about regime change through legal means.
The Saba movement agitated for change, democratic space, economic reforms, law reform, and so on. And I believe that the women movement joined the Saba movement to ensure that the women's agenda was felt and carried on board, and especially when the movement for constitutional and legal reforms peaked. I am aware that the women's movement was fully involved. At that point, I was a founder and board member of FIDA Kenya, and we were fully involved in seeing that the rights of women are integrated as part of the Kenyan law.
In 1992, Parliament amended the constitution to facilitate the holding of the general elections within the new multi-party dispensation. Following the election, civil society entered the scene as drivers of the constitutional reform agenda. Until then, constitutional processes had been dominated by political players at the exclusion of citizen groups. This was the first real instance where the civilian voice was being heard through the various civil society groups and religious organizations. ICG Kenya, Kenya Human Rights Commission, and Law Society of Kenya commissioned the writing of a draft model constitution dubbed the Kenya Tuitakayo. At the launch in 1994 at Ufungamano House, a steering committee was formed with representation from other organizations, including some of the women organizations like FIDA. This eventually led to the convening of the National Constituency Assembly that adopted this constitution.
I was one of the commissioners and a vice chairperson of the Ufungamano process, and I can tell you that women were in the forefront alongside the religious leaders and civil society in ensuring that Ufungamano was formed and was a success. So we were fully behind it, and as the country was agitating for constitutional reforms, the women organizations were unified, irrespective of their political agenda, tribal affiliations, and so on and so forth. And most of us found ourselves at the Ufungamano process.
At the political front, the opposition parties in 1997 negotiated a minimum reform package through the Inter-Parties Parliamentary Group. The reforms which were negotiated by the MPs and agreed upon included, amongst others, securing the independence of the Electoral Commission. Nomination of MPs was to be based on party numbers in Parliament, allowing the President to appoint ministers from members of the National Assembly who did not belong to his party, amongst others. Women had been organizing themselves to participate in the constitutional review process. Women like Atsango Chesoni and Phoebe Asio were working on bringing the women's agenda into the IPPG. Supported by the Collaborative Center for Gender and Development, Martha Karua too was at the center of the IPPG and lobbied hard to ensure that 50% of nomination seats were set for women.
The Interparliamentary Parties Group discussions in 1997, the IPPG, when we had the minimum reform package which was put together. And so Martha Karua was part of that team, and so was Phoebe Asio. And so they then made those demands. Martha Karua specifically went into the negotiating. She was in the negotiating team, and so that is how we got that section amended. But we were not successful. We had asked that she seek negotiations on the citizenship clauses in relation to sections 90 and 91. That we were not successful with. She had also tried to have 82 for B and C which was another way in which we were discriminated against. Now, 82(4)(b) and C are the ones which said that you could discriminate in matters of personal law. That one they refused completely to amend.
This set the stage for women to be nominated into parliament, and some very dynamic women made it through this window. The Constitution of Kenya Review Bill was published in August 1997 and passed by parliament with no consultation of civil society and religious groups. This approach was rejected by the civil society, and as a result, the act was later amended by the Constitution of Kenya Review Amendment Act 1998, where public participation was recognized as the driving principle of the review process.
There's one thing that I would like us to talk about, and we keep forgetting that the constitutional process, apart from the agitation, there were other conferences. Remember, there was Bomas 1, Bomas 2, and Safari Park. And the women were fully involved in all those meetings that enabled us as the women's movement to come up with names of likely commissioners when the CKRC Act was enacted, I think in 1997, 1998. However, when the government went, on its own, ignoring civil society, then Ufungamano process came in, and at the Ufungamano initiative, there were several women as well, maybe about 7 or 8 of us. And when the government appointed a commission without the participation of civil society and the opposition, then there was still agitation. And you remember when Yash Balgai was appointed as chair, he made an attempt to bring the two processes together, and we negotiated. I was involved together with Dr. Oko Mbaka, may God rest his soul in peace, and the leadership of Ufungamano in amending further the CKRC Act, and in the process of picking 10 out of the 21 commissioners that were there in Ufungamano. And remember, Ufungamano was actually a voluntary process where we gave up our time, our careers, as we went around the country collecting and collating views of Kenyans. So we negotiated not only an amendment, but the inclusion, the numbers to be picked, and the actual picking of commissioners. And about, is it 4 of us from Ufungamano found ourselves joining, 4 or 5 of us, women, joining the 10 who then were integrated into the Constitution of Kenya Review Commission.
During the first national meeting organized by the Attorney General in Bomas in May 1998, women participated through the KWPC and presented their case, as well as in the subsequent 4 consultation sessions held at Safari Park.
When the Attorney General called the first Bomas meeting to discuss the way forward on constitutional review, the women were given 1 slot. They could be represented by 1 person. And because they were ready, they quickly sent a delegation to the Attorney General saying, we have the population and 1 slot is not good enough. To give him his due, he gave them 9 more slots. So the 10 women went to represent the women at the first Bomas. So during that time, the rest of the women organized themselves to keep a vigil outside Bomas, telling everybody, with placards telling everybody who would listen, and even those who would not, that they were ready to take part along their men to make sure that this time round, with the constitution making, they had their place. And that's where women started and went to, now what progressed to Safari Park 1, 2, 3. Along this time, that's when I was also invited as a gender analyst and as a gender consultant for the women. So I came in as a consultant because of the skills that I had already acquired. And as I came for the women, the disability movement also said, now that you are there on the table, as you talk about gender issues, don't forget about disability issues. So throughout that process, I was a technical support for both the women and the disability movement.
Women negotiated for their participation in the process. Women were also credited for suggesting the district strategy and constituency level structures to ensure maximum participation of the people in the review process.
The issue of the 3 tiers of government and the issue of devolution was actually started by the women. The structure, the first structure that was developed in Safari Park, but nobody ever acknowledges that, was actually developed by women at Lenana Hotel. That's where we had a meeting for 3 days, and we actually discussed the importance of having the national government. There were no counties at the time, then the district government, and all the way to the, to the locational levels and also village levels, and so on. And we actually had a presentation. Every time there were presentations being done, there was always a women's presentation to be done and to be presented and considered.
It is through these negotiations that eventually women were recognized as a stakeholder group. Just like faith-based organizations and political parties, women continue to edge themselves into the process step by step. They managed to get women to be included in the drafting team of the review bill. This achieved very significant gains for women and set the tempo on how women engaged in the review process. In these consultations, the women worked closely with the Attorney General, who they saw as an ally. When the bill was tabled in Parliament, there was resistance in having women organizations included in the bill. The women parliamentarians in the House at the time played an important role in protecting this provision. The women organizations under the auspices of the KWPC organized a nomination process that involved interviews to fill their 5 slots for commissioners. Honorable Phoebe Asio, Professor Wanjiko Kabira, Miss Nancy Baraza, Miss Abida Ali Aroni, and Miss Salome Moigai was selected. A group of women affiliated to the Maendeleo ya Wanawake organization contested the list of nominees, citing that they were urban women and some regions had not been represented. This contestation was being sponsored in the background by the ruling party KANU at the time.
So by the time it was agreed that we were going to start a constitution review, which was to have, I think, 25 commissioners, the women were given 5 slots. And the women were very happy. They were not happy because that was what they wanted, but it has been we had come a long way from the time of being given 1 slot. So the women went away and quickly organized around it and did their selection processes, which were democratic and they were transparent. Before the dust had settled, word came back that the KANU government of the day had decided to remove the women's political caucus as a stakeholder. So we were again called over a weekend to go and strategize on how to remain alive. And again, during this time, I was also giving my skills as a gender analyst. So by the time it came to the motion came to the floor of Parliament, we are happy to say that the motion lost. We were not thrown out. However, on the floor of the Parliament, we had a woman with a disability, Honorable Josephine Sinyo, and she actually made an amendment, or proposed an amendment, that of the 5 women, 1 must be a woman with a disability. To give women their due, they did not follow with it on the floor of the Parliament. But as soon as they got out, the women MPs were on Josephine's case. How can you take one of our slots? And Josephine said, what do you mean 1 of your slots? We are women also, which was a surprise for women's movement, because women's movement all along had not considered disability as their issue. But those were the days before diversity and inclusion. I hope by now we have moved from that point. But that's how it came now. When out of the 5, now that one had to be a woman with disability, and I had been part of the movement, it was much easier for them to pick on me.
Women had learned to move together, and we had become a very strong movement that was able to sit at the table. We forced ourselves onto the table. We were not invited, to begin negotiating with the other stakeholders. And you probably have heard about how the meeting took place in Bomas, and and also Safari Park. There were a series of meetings at Safari Park, and we used to meet. All the organizations chose their leaders, and we used to meet at Safari Park and be there early to actually agree on the position we are taking for that particular day, because we knew the issues and who were going to speak on our behalf. And it was very organized. There were some fantastic women, who were participating at that level. And I just hope we will continue to remember them, like Jael Bogo, Phoebe Asio, Jane Kiano, Zipporah Kitonyi. There were many. And Martha Karua, of course. As always, she was a warrior. Even at the, going back now to 1997, negotiating, trying to push Parliament, to accept Phoebe Asio's motion. And by the way, anyone who wants to read, they can actually just go to Parliament and get the, the documentation, or the words, the words of all those individual women who participated at that level. So at Safari Park, we were actually able to mobilize ourselves. And this is where, having talked about affirmative action, it became like, every woman would talk about affirmative action wherever we were, even when the Constitution, civic education and collection of the views started. So it was a very important thing to participate in the negotiation of making of the laws. And I happen to have been in the negotiation of the law itself. So myself, Phoebe Asio, Zipporah Kitonyi again, Martha Karua, Abida Ali, Aroni, Martha Kome, and Nancy Baraza. So, but we happened to push everything that we wanted for women in terms of the process, including the fact that we would want to choose our own commissioners. People should not choose for us. So that process went on very well. And let me also admit that Amos Wako was very supportive of the women in the process. And he would always, every time we requested for to be represented, he would be willing to do it. Until we learned also that you don't ask for one position. If there are 12 men and they are 49% and we are 51, then we had to look for ways of getting as many women as we could. So instead of going as one organization, we said, okay, we'll be represented by Women Political Caucus, by Women Political Alliance, by National Council. So we would actually make those ones, the institutions through which we could have the representation done. And in that way, we may not get all of them, but we'll get more than one, instead of one representing the women. And of course, you are only allowed to speak once. And so if you say one sentence or give one issue or two issues, that's all that will appear in the documentation. So we managed to go through to bring on into the process itself.
Following the UN Women's Conference in Beijing, in 1996, Charity Ngilu moved a motion in Parliament for the implementation of the Beijing Platform for Action. This motion was, however, defeated. Charity Ngilu would later run for presidency against the incumbent President Moi in 1997. Though she did not win, she had demystified the presidency for women. In 1997, Phoebe Asio moved a motion on affirmative action in Parliament. The motion sought to require the government to pass legislation compelling political parties to nominate at least 30% of their candidates as women, introduce an amendment to the constitution to create 2 constituencies solely for women in each of the 8 provinces, and introduced legislation for funding of political parties which would be linked to the percentage of women in the party. Though the motion was defeated, it set the stage for further discussion on women's political participation. It was after this that Kenya Women Political Caucus was established in 1997, which played a very useful role in coordinating women's participation in the constitutional review process.
Phoebe Asio brought an affirmative action motion in Parliament in 1987, which was lost on the floor of Parliament. And as the women sat there to mourn this failure of this motion to be passed, for them it was a loss of a battle, but the beginning of the war. They left that place with one decision: we are going into politics, and we are going to organize around politics. And that's when Women's Political Caucus was formed, with Phoebe Asio as the chair.
In 1997 was when Honorable Phoebe Asio presented a motion in Parliament to bring a bill that would ensure that Parliament introduces the provisions that would allow for an extra 18 women in the country to join Parliament, 2 of them from each region. We had 8 regions. That would be 16, but Rift Valley, because of its size, would bring 4. And during that meeting, KANU was mobilized to come and defeat it. But all the women from KANU joined the other women to support the motion, and a few men. I still remember Omamo refusing to go and vote against the motion, but since KANU had fully been mobilized, it was defeated. I also remember Grace Mowa coming in, straight from the airport to come and support the other women, with Phoebe Asio and also Zipporah Kitonyi, among others. So, but we had gathered, the rest of the women had mobilized, and we had gathered in the gallery. So women did not even know. It was like the end of the world had come, because we had mobilized to make sure that this happens, and we thought it was so little to ask for. But even as I say that, let me also say that we had also very good supporters at that meeting. People like Orengo spoke very well about the bill. So did the late Oko Obaka. So did Kiraitu Murungi. Quite a number of members of parliament then in the opposition. They supported the bill, but we still lost because the majority were KANU supporters. So, but after that meeting, after the defeat of the motion, we met actually outside the parliament, within parliament, under the, if you like, Phoebe Asio and the other members of parliament who were there, women members of parliament. And that's when we started Women Political Caucus at that meeting. And we agreed that that was not the end of the journey, but the beginning of a much longer journey, and that we will not end until we have the women's interest taken into the making of the new constitution, or whether it was being revised or a new one was being taken on board.
Until 2010, when you looked at the percentages of women, in fact until 2013, when you looked at the percentage of women parliamentarians, the percentage of women parliamentarians has never exceeded 10% in this country. And so that was a very clear illustration of the exclusion of women from decision making. And so Honorable Phoebe Asio brought this motion to Parliament to commit the Kenyan Parliament to ensuring that at least 1/3 of the members of Parliament were women. So unfortunately the motion failed. But something very positive happened despite that failure, which was the recognition by women that we needed to organize across party lines. And we needed women from different sectors to work together in order to ensure that we got our civil and political rights recognized. And so women begin to openly, assertively, deliberately seek civil and political rights in this country. And the Kenya Women's Political Caucus was actually born out of that failure. We literally, I have the privilege of having been in Parliament that day. And so after the motion had failed, we went to one of the lounges, and the women agreed that we were going to put together the Women's Political Caucus, which was now going to demand and press for the 1/3 principle.
For women, we have always been marginalized one way or the other. And obviously, unless you're at the table, there's every possibility that your agenda will not be carried on board. Women are close to half, if not more, of the citizens of this country. So you cannot ignore them. You cannot purport to sit on the table without women if you want to carry women along. Remember also that due to our socialization and the political agenda of the country, women have lagged behind. So there was a need to pull women along in order to achieve equity amongst the citizens of this country. So it was really an important aspect. And bearing in mind that the women's agenda was on the table alongside the agitation for other rights.
We must think about protecting the gains, fighting to make sure that the gains we have are realized, and at the same time continue the journey of transforming our societies. Changing the mainstream is one of the things that we must begin to focus on.
The issue of women and gender equality is not a women's issue. It is a Kenyan issue. You remember what somebody said, that when they came for the Jews, I said I was not a Jew. And when they came for the women, I said I was not a woman. By the time they came for me, there was nobody to stand for me. It's up to all Kenyans to ensure that this constitution that we gave to ourselves is implemented to the letter for the good of all Kenyans. The women of Kenya are full citizens, and so are the men of Kenya. So are the children, both boys and girls of Kenya. So it is a Kenyan issue, and we each have a duty to ensure that it happens.
If you look at Scandinavian countries like Finland, countries like Norway, where gender parity has been achieved, the Human Development Index, which is produced by UNDP reports every year, their development index is very high, as compared to countries which are still grappling with gender imbalance in decision making. Okay, so we are doing an injustice not just to women, but we are doing an injustice to this country, because it means our human development or our social development index is dragged downwards, so that we look very sophisticated as Kenyans, but we are quite a bit backward in that regard. So I think we should realize that empowering women and realizing equitable participation in decision making at whatever level and within all spheres is good for this country.
The demand for Harry Thuku to be released, if we go, if I take us back to pre-independence, the demand for Harry Thuku to be released when the first person shot on the staircase on the steps of the Norfolk Hotel was a woman, Mary Nyanjiru. She is the one who demanded that Harry Thuku be released. Again, we don't talk about her. So my point is that at every single step in the democratic struggle in this country, there have been women, and the democratic space would not be available in this country were it not for the participation of women.